So we'll look at some examples built using Power Virtual Agent in a low code, no code fashion in a way that a simple, relatively low skill um, programmer or just a business user can create. The idea here is let's focus on areas that this can be applied to, and then we'll look at adding more layers of complexity as a discussion point going forward. Just to simply paint a picture for the overall cycle that we look at for the dev process for a bot, we not only look at pushing a bot out of the gate in a single go, we also look at operationalizing it in a way that supports constant updates, in a way that supports analytics, in a way that supports continuous improvement, with inputs from the business, right? So just painting the entire picture for the bot here, we'll start off by creating the bot from a very simple graphical, low code, no code interface. And then we'll slap more layers on top depending on our needs. And if we have to, we'll see how we can publish this outside of Teams, maybe in some cases, where necessary, right? Again, just keep an open mind as you go through some of these examples and think about use cases that would apply to you. In our future discovery sessions, we'll peel back the layers for your specific use case. The one thing I do want to highlight, of course, is a lot of the bot interactions require data to be read and written to systems that are either internal or external. When I say internal, these could be Microsoft specific solutions, um, accessible through standard connectors in Power Automate, or you could have some complex custom connectors or premium connectors for third-party applications like an Oracle ERP or a Salesforce, or maybe even Fire servers if you have that type of a setup in your organization, right? So just keep that in mind that as we go deep and deep into this concept of bots and bots on teams, we have to look at how we can operate on data that does not live in the immediate vicinity. So the first bot I want to talk about is what we call a clinical inquiry bot. Now, this can have multiple flavors, but the core concept is allowing the ability for a lookup operation from within teams. So we've got different organizations. Some of you, in fact, here on this call, you've implemented concepts like virtual rounding using Teams, right? So how do you pair that concept of looking up a patient on, based on their name, MRN number, or any other qualifier? How can you set that type of an experience up? This is kind of a quick overview of the clinical inquiry bot. And I'll play this video. However, I'll go through a quick voiceover and do a live demo if time permits. The idea here is that the clinical inquiry bot lets you expose to your stakeholders what type of operations you want to do. In this case, we're going to do a lookup operation for a patient's medication. So we've just simulated this using dummy data. We didn't have live data to work with. So the idea here is you could, by way of proposing some questions, qualify what a provider wants to get at corresponding to a patient. So in this case, essentially, we're having some qualification questions, and we have a mechanism to surface all of the current medications that a patient is subscribed for, that the patient is scheduled to either receive or act on, along with things like appointment details and so on and so forth. Some of you who are familiar with this concept of FHIR do know that we have two connector types for FHIR as part of the Power Automate suite, um, and that you could extrapolate some of that by building your own connectors or simply pull in data from Power Automate through meaningful data models that are already in place. Just to give you a quick tangible customer example of creating something similar, one of our customers did create like a lookup experience in one of their bots, and I just wanted to put it out there for a more visual consumption, suggesting that you could look up patients and you could create an experience that allows for selecting in cases of multiple entries, and you can do a whole lot more with so generated lists in that experience. So in this case, you can see I'm looking for a patient with first name David, and then the system spits out all of the query results essentially in a way that I can narrow down to my the David that I'm looking for, not having to type in more, essentially. That's one of the questions we get a lot from customers. Is bots are good, but we have to type a lot. Just know that you can at any level clip the whole conversational aspect from chat and make it more visual and clickable by adding constructs in the Teams app. Next format that we're going to look at is something that you might call like a referral bot, or in provider sense, they call it curbside consults quite a lot. So the idea here is a PCP or a primary care provider should have the ability to, first of all, learn on the job, and secondly, have the ability to find a specialist when they need it, as they need it, right? So the idea here is not only are you creating a frequently asked questions experience that the bot is going to help with, right? You're also enabling escalation or connecting to a specialist if need be. So just to, take a step back, in this case, you can see in the screenshot, the idea here is that the referral bot is going to prompt the PCP or any other technician or clinical support staff for a prompt. And that prompt could be, in this case, a symptom or diagnosis, right, that they need assistance with. Presented with that input, the bot is going to spit out, of course, based on what it has been programmed to learn. It will spit out recommended orders that might be in the system, along with the option to access notes. Deep linking is something you can think about. And again, notice at the end, always leading in with the option to ask for assistance, whether it's synchronous through a call or a meeting, or asynchronous through a message posted on Teams, either it's chat or a channel message. So curbside consults are common in healthcare. You guys probably know more about that than me. However, different flavors. This example that I'm sharing with you is for a customer that we did a implementation for their OBGYN group. In fact, that same customer was kind enough to share with us some screenshots of their implementation. They implemented this bot. Again, notice how this is mobile first. So the doctors are not essentially, or the caregivers are not essentially tied to a workstation or a laptop or a device that has low mobility. They're carrying this experience around in their pocket and are able to explore different care paths, different orders. Again, with a twofold approach: one being finding quick care for the patient, and secondly, using it as their own learning experience for navigating processes and sometimes even building on their knowledge on how to approach a particular patient. Okay. Moving on, format number 3, I want to say, is this concept of triaging. And the use case that I'm sharing here is a mental health bot, right? Triaging continues to be one of the biggest pain points in healthcare, and operationally, one of the most slowest steps, um, in the entire value chain. So not knowing where to push a patient and not knowing what resources are free and when, that continues to be a major challenge. On top of that, there are instances where the care team involved in the triaging process is not necessarily all clinical users, right? So you have administrative staff, you have case workers, you have social workers, you have nurses, you have doctors. The entire plethora of personas that you can think of interact with the system and have different ways of triaging and finding resources for where to route a patient as part of that next step in the journey, right? So this use case that I'm going to talk about is for a mental health bot. I named it Sparsh, which means in my language a gentle, supportive touch. And the idea here is for situations where patients or members of your, you know, user group, customers, if you will, who are dealing with depression, anxiety, substance abuse, or suicidal thoughts, anything in that mental health area, they have an option to, usually they take some standard tests that are out there. And the idea here is based on the results of the tests that they've taken, the bot will route the patient to the best possible or best defined next action, which could be either referring them to a hospital or pushing them out or registering or signing them up for a care class. It could be, nudging them towards a group health type of situation, or just pointing them towards self-help resources, right? So this is just an example of applying that concept of triaging and knowing where to send a patient or an internal resource. Again, extrapolate this into some of the non-clinical settings. You could actually replace the patient object with something else and think about where to route something next or where to triage something next based on business rules that you define. Moving on, I'm just quickly going to introduce a couple more formats before, uh, if time permits, going into a live demo. The next concept I want to introduce, if you want to add more layers to this bot experience, you might argue that, hey, looking up questions is not something that I really want from, right? So the idea here is we've extrapolated or added another dimension to this, which is the bots can look up into an external calendar. Now, in my example, these calendars are defined in using Microsoft Bookings. Um, and so in this example, we're talking about a vaccine scheduling bot. Um, we stood something similar up at a variety of customers during the time when vaccines were first rolled out. So that screenshot is a little dated. But the idea here is that the bot can query, remember going back to our topic about connectors, the bot can query an external system, in this case, a Microsoft Bookings calendar, pull available appointment slots for a particular service that you can arrive at by way of inviting chat-based inputs from a user. Once you have those inputs, of course, you can have the user select what dates and times work, and you can create automations for maybe even a follow-up appointment. So in this case, what we did was we prompted an internal employee, an employee of a healthcare provider who was expected to, or the whole group of people who were expected to get their jabs before everybody else. We spun this up in order to support their scheduling, just powered by their Office 365 profile, routing them to their nearest vaccine clinic, and so on and so forth. So the idea is, again, think about bots and think about what other data you can bring into that conversational experience in order to make that bot experience richer and more meaningful. Again, this is for an internal only scenario. If you're looking to add or remove the concept of identity, I should say, and maybe make it available generically, you can publish a bot outside of Teams, no problem. I guess the last model I'm going to leave you with is this concept of supply chain bots. In this case, this bot queries an external ERP system. It could be Oracle, it could be something else. And the concept here is very often supply chain and inventory operations are, um, you know, somewhat less effective or less efficient because of lack of tracking, lack of notification or priority based um, proactive updates that you can configure. However, the concept that we're introducing here is, similar to how you would look up a help desk ticket. You could attach that same concept to a supply chain bot, um, allow for capabilities like tracking an order or making modifications to the status of an order. You could also create concepts like, proactive notifications for when an order is received or placed, and pair it up with some of the concepts that Mark showed earlier around approvals, right? So if you have a more vertical, complex chain of command for um, approvals, for following a certain process for signing and approving documents before an order is placed and received. Just think about how you can add or subtract some capabilities with the system, not having to necessarily, go through a bunch of meetings or a bunch of emails to track down a body of work that needs to be moved forward. Okay. So that's kind of the supply chain thing. I will um, quickly cut over to the demo piece by closing out with this concept of adding more layers to a bot experience. Very often we get this feedback that, hey, doctors don't have time for typing in stuff. And we totally get it. However, there is value in creating a system of being able to define business rules, and those business rules having to require inputs from a user, and pairing it up with more dimensions. Now, the beauty of Teams as a platform is you can create your own app and you can slap some of those static elements like web pages from your SharePoint or from an external source or a Power App. You can slap some of those sources onto a more complex or a multidimensional application, right? So in this case, very quickly, just to add more context, what you're seeing is an example of a chatbot, but you'll also notice that on the top there are different, tabs. So this concept of tabs has been used to extrapolate on just the bot experience and layer on some static content or content which does not require chat-based interaction or typing. So you can simply look it up at any given time, right? Most of you might have already seen the Adoption Hub if you've been part of um, the Customer Hub program. But the idea is, again, just think about as you think through your use case, chatbots are not necessarily limited to only that text-based messaging interface, right? With that, I'm going to cut over into a demo. So just quickly going through the use cases that I talked about earlier. The first use case we looked at was the clinical inquiry bot. Remember, we started to query a patient's information from a FHIR server. The concept here is demonstrated, and I just created a dummy conversation before this meeting. We'll wait for this to load. So the concept here is you can define what type of an experience you want to provide to your end user, the person who is interacting with the system. In my case, I'm presenting them with a card or an adaptive card with clickable actions. So the clickable action in the example that I'm sharing with you is to display patient information or overview, just like a high level snapshot of a patient's info, right? In my case, I have very limited dummy data to work with. So just assume that this can be extrapolated to a quick lookup function. But the idea here is that I could search for a patient's last name, and then here's an example, and I just clicked on it. There's a few qualification questions that lead me to that patient object, right? In which case, I can decide if I want to do something with this patient object or not. I can decide if I want to start a group chat, perhaps, or take this patient's MRN or some other information and start like a channel post or a meeting with the care team that is associated with the patient. Okay. Second option we talked about was this mental health bot. And again, the idea is pretty straightforward. You're presenting the person who's interacting with the system, you're presenting with them with a variety of options to choose from. In my case, I'm assuming that I'm a medical assistant in some capacity, and that I'm interacting with a patient who's suffering from anxiety, and that they have already taken an industry standard test called a GAD-7 score. In which case, depending on the score that they've produced, I now know where to route them to, right? And this is where most of the triaging struggles were, not knowing where a patient is supposed to go, not just based on the results of their tests, but also logistically, how to find an appointment, how to make an appointment to a calendar right then and there, and having to context switch to different applications, look up a variety of notes and sheets and things of that nature. The other thing we looked at, of course, was this vaccine scheduling bot. Um, and I'll just quickly show you the concept. Again, it's not high fidelity for the reason that this is dummy data. So the idea here is based on a few qualification questions that were asked, in this case, height, weight, and that type of stuff, the bot is able to pair that data entered through chat with data from an Office 365 profile or other metadata existing elsewhere, do a lookup operation, pair that up with a recommendation for a calendar, right? So in this case, when I select a date, I'm presented with the times that I can block a particular service for. Vaccination is just an example. You can think of equipment in a hospital system that is difficult and scarce to get hold of. You can think of any other services, maybe even internal mental health services or employee welfare services, HR. You can think of a variety of scenarios that you can use to pair a rule-based bot with a bookings calendar and so on and so forth. So the final demo that we looked at in the slides, I've skipped over a couple of examples in the interest of time. The final thing we looked at was the adoption hub. So the idea of creating more layers um, to the bot experience. So in this case, you can see there is a chat bot, of course, but I also have other tabs on the top. Um, so if I wanted to, make this like a assistant bot or an FAQ bot, I'm also providing other ways in which users can interact with the system. Not only is it a chat-based mechanism, back and forth and synchronous, I could also layer some asynchronous static content, like forms or some form of websites or portals that you want to open up to your end users. Just think about that as you think through the ideation process. If you do get a chance and if you are a developer, I would highly encourage you to check out the developer portal for Teams. Um, each application that you create using the developer portal allows you to add different app features, right? So this concept of personal apps and the concept of bots is pretty easy for you to plug in or stitch into your application. And if you are targeting only bots, know that if your bot already exists and it's been created elsewhere, you can always add an existing bot to a custom application, right? You don't have to start from scratch. If you do decide to start from scratch, and if you're still just dipping your toes in the water and looking for some quick prototype um, making or prototype building exercise, there is a Power Virtual Agent application inside of Teams, right? So just know that this exists, which lets you build a chatbot within the context of a team. So in my case, I built this mental health chatbot within the construct of a team, and then I published it out to all employees of my fictitious organization. And just to give you an idea for how simple it is and how like a low code, no code approach we're following, you would notice that there is a concept of a variety of topics that we've defined or imported from elsewhere. And simply by dragging and dropping stuff and by creating like a visual flow, we've created a conversation or the construct of a conversation. Remember, topics add up towards a conversation. So we've created that construct of a logical flow diagram, if you will, um, that kind of bases inputs or it picks up inputs from a user and bases the follow-up conversation based on the inputs that are so procured. So in this case, for example, I've defined a condition where if somebody's score is greater than or equal to 5, they get routed to the Department of Psychiatry, and that's where I can pair it up with a bookings calendar or something to that effect.